The conference is in lecture mode.
Hello, everyone. While we're waiting for the webinar to start, please feel free to answer the question we have open here. The title of this webinar is REB Governance in TCPS2. I'm Hanan Abdelakir. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with the Secretariat on Responsible Conduct of Research, formerly the Secretariat on Research Ethics. I would like first to thank you for taking the time of your busy schedule for the presentation. And we'll start with some technical housekeeping. We're using both the internet and the phone for the audio for this presentation, which means that you can hear my voice through your computer and over the phone. If you're hearing my voice through both, you may be experiencing a delay. If this is happening to you, I suggest that you either turn down the volume on your computer or hang up the phone. If you are on the phone, we are in what's called lecture mode, where your lines are muted. If you need to speak to someone, please call the number on the slide, which is the Secretariat number from our website. The material that we're covering today is on PowerPoint slides. They're presented to you using Adobe Connect. You should see one of the slides now. If you're having problems connecting, your first contact should be your local help people, and then to test your compatibility with Adobe Connect using the test URL that was sent to you with your confirmation. If those two steps don't work for you, you may contact the Secretariat by email or phone. Again, the address and the number are on the slide and on our website. We're using a polling feature of Adobe Connect. It means that I can open windows with multiple choice questions that you can answer. An example is open right now. But if you have your screen set to full screen, then you cannot see any of the polls. So if you cannot see the poll I just referred to, which is entitled, How do you define your primary role responsibility? Then change your full screen setting using the button on the top right-hand corner on the slide. The presentation will be about 40 minutes long, followed by a question and answer session. And at the end of my presentation, I will open a window for you to type in your questions, which I will be responding to verbally. Note that today's presentation is in English only. The same webinar will be presented in French in exactly 1 week time by Sarah Issam, a member of the Secretariat on Responsible Conduct of Research. Both versions will be recorded and will be posted to our website in approximately 3 weeks' time. One last housekeeping point. The demand for the webinars has far exceeded our expectations, which has resulted in some people having to follow along over the phone with a copy of the slides that was sent to them. To those people, my apologies for the inconvenience of having to do this, and I will try to remember to speak to the polls and the title of the slide as I transition through the presentation. So now I'll show you the results of the poll. So the question is, how do you define your primary role and responsibility? And the results of the poll are that almost 25% are REB members 38% REB administrator, 19% researchers, and 15% other. Next slide, objective. At the end of the presentation, you should have an understanding of the foundational, operational, and procedural issues relevant to the ethics review of research involving humans. These issues are of interest to all involved in research ethics. It is of particular interest to REB members and chairs and REB administration staff, and the actual results of the poll are reflective of this fact. Next slide. Outline of presentation, the W's of REB governance. The basic questions that this presentation addresses are: why create an REB? Who is responsible for establishing the REB and giving it its mandate and authority? We're going to discuss the basic membership requirements of an REB and its quorum rules, the process and jurisdiction of the REB, what options are available for the REB regarding the level of ethics review, what the process of appealing an REB decision. And finally, we will touch on what should be the REB process during publicly declared emergencies. Next slide. Why create an REB? The three federal research agencies, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, promote research that's conducted according to the highest ethical standards. They've adopted the TCPS as the benchmark for the ethical conduct of research involving humans. And as a condition of funding, the agencies require researchers and their institutions to apply the guidance in the policy. It's formalized through an MOU between the agencies and the institutions that have been deemed eligible to receive and manage funds from the three agencies. Being accountable for the research within its own jurisdiction, institutions have a responsibility to create the necessary structure of an REB to review the ethical acceptability of the research in accordance with TCPS 2. The strength of the TCPS is in its reach-through provision. This promotes the application of the same set of guidance within the institution for all types of research. TCPS 2 applies to all research, funded and non-funded, that falls within the jurisdiction of the institution. I'm also I'm interested actually in knowing the number of approximately how many applications per year does your REB review, and I've now posted a poll and invite you to respond to this poll. So I will now show you the results. The question is approximately how many applications per year does your REB review, and 11% between 1 and 10 applications, 11% between 11 and 30 applications, 15% 31 to 60 applications, and 12% between 70 and 100 applications. And I will actually, the more than 100 applications is the majority. Over 50% have more than 100 applications. And the results of this poll show that there are differences between institutions, and so the number of REBs within an institution is dependent actually on the volume and the range of research within the institution. And it's interesting to see the results of the poll. So large institutions may find it necessary to have more than one REB, to have specialized REBs, for example, in clinical trials in social sciences and humanities. Others may have general REBs that review all types of research. Smaller institutions and others with smaller workloads or with limited resources may share REBs. So next slide is who establishes an REB? Article 6.2 of the TCPS clarifies that the highest body of an institution shall establish or appoint an REB. Some institutions may decide to appoint an external REB, and TCPS2 advises that this should be done based on an official agreement in which the institution remains accountable for the ethics of research within its jurisdiction. Institutions should also ensure that the REB is able, when creates the REB, that it should be able to operate effectively by providing the REB with the appropriate administrative and financial support to allow the REB to fulfill its duty, and by providing the REB members and the REB administrators with the necessary training opportunities to deliver on their responsibilities. TCPS2 also encourages institutions to recognize the role and the valued contributions of the REB members. Also, REBs need independence in their decision-making process to carry out their role effectively. This is in fact one of the key clarifications relevant to governance in TCPS2. The TCPS2 clarifies that independence of the REB is independence in its decision-making capacity. It is not independence from the institution. The REB is created by the institution and remains accountable for the integrity of its process to that institution. I will now move to next slide, case study number 1, and will now give you the time to read through the case study number 1, and once done, please respond to the question in the poll. Okay. I will now broadcast the results. So the question is, who should establish the REB? 34% said it should be the president. 59% said that should be board of governors, and 6% said VP academic. So let's look at the next slide, which outlines considerations for case study number 1. The response to this question is that it could be either the board of governors or the president of the institution. It depends on the institution and its governance structure. Some institutions have the president as the highest level. Others have the board of governors. This is the reason why actually TCPS2 does not specify which body within an institution should appoint the REB. What TCPS2 provides is a range of possibilities, and it provides some examples. It's not an exhaustive list of examples, but for example, it includes president, rector or CEO, governing council, board of directors, council of administration. You'll note that the examples provided refer to bodies with mainly administrative responsibilities. It should not be the VP academic for 2 reasons. The first is that the VP is most likely not the highest body of the institution, and the second is that given the VP's main responsibility in research, and this may conflict with the VP's responsibilities for ethics. And some may argue that the president also has such responsibility, and the response to that is that the president has a wider range of responsibilities than those of the VP academic regarding research, and is accountable for the whole institution. So to summarize the considerations for making this decision, they are mainly to look at who is considered the highest governance body within the institution. The reference here should be to the highest administrative rather than academic responsibility. And the other consideration is for institutions to assess what other responsibilities this body has and whether such other responsibilities may conflict with its responsibility for establishing the REB. I will now move to the next slide. What are the mandate and authority of the REB? The mandate of the REB, as we all know, is to review the ethical acceptability of research within its jurisdiction, within the jurisdiction of the REB, it applies to all research involving humans subject to TCPS2. A revised definition of TCPS2 is provided in the application of Article 2.1. One of the additions to TCPS2 is a definition of participants. Also, this is provided in application of Article 2.1. So what do we mean by within its jurisdiction or under its auspices here? First, there is the jurisdiction of the institution, which means that research is conducted within the premises of the institution or its affiliates, or conducted by members of the institution, staff, researchers, and students, no matter where the research is conducted, in the institution's lab, in a remote community, in another province, or another country. There are various scenarios where members of the institution have multiple affiliations or conduct research that falls under multiple jurisdictions. And we will touch on this in the upcoming case study. As for the jurisdiction of the REB itself, where the institution creates one REB only, the institution's jurisdiction normally becomes the REB jurisdiction as it relates to the review of the ethics of research involving humans. But where the institution creates multiple REBs, the institution should define the jurisdiction of each of the REBs and should coordinate the operation of its REBs. In any case, the jurisdiction of the REB should be outlined clearly in institutional policies. In fulfilling its mandate, the REB shall be guided by principles of TCPS2, respect for persons concerned for welfare and justice. And those principles have been addressed in more details in our first webinar, and its recording is now posted on the Panel on Research Ethics website. Now the authority of the REB. With regards to the authority of the REB, it's outlined in Article 6.3, and it's mainly to approve, reject, propose modifications to, or terminate proposed or ongoing research. TCPS2 advises institutions to respect the authority that the institution delegates to the REB. So, if an REB makes a decision to reject an application, the only possible way to override this decision is through an appeal process, which I will cover later in the presentation. It's important to note that the REB decision is limited to giving the green light to the ethical acceptability of the research. It does not in itself constitute authorization for the research to proceed. For example, there may be other institutional requirements that the research needs to comply with before the research is allowed to proceed. In fulfilling its mandate and authority, the TCPS encourages open communication between the REBs and the researchers for the mutual benefit of both. I will now move to case study number 2 and invite you to go through the case study and respond to the question that I will be posting now. I will now broadcast the results, and basically the question is, should the researcher submit his PhD thesis for review by the second university REB? And 65% said yes, and 35% said no. Now we'll move to the following slide, which is considerations in case study number 2. Again, in the world of ethics, there is no black and white response. The response to this question is that it depends on the situation. Following guidance in TCPS2, we should look at whether the researcher is using his affiliation to the second university. For example, if he's using the letterhead of the second university for informing participants about his research, or using any of the resources of the second university to conduct the research, for example, the lab of the second university. If the researcher is not referring to the second university or using any of its resources, he only needs to submit his research for review by the first university REB. However, if the researcher is in fact referring to his affiliation to the second university or using its resources, he should submit his research for REB review by both the first and the second universities. The reason being that when the researcher makes reference to his affiliation to the university, he carries with him the reputation of that university. TCPS2 provides, if this is the case that it's the researcher is submitting to both universities, TCPS2 provides flexibility regarding how the second institution conducts its review. I'm referring here to the possibility of having the research reviewed by the delegated review process, following the proportionate approach to research ethics review. And there are numerous scenarios and situations within institutions, and the institution is best positioned to make a decision on those situations. Where the institution determines that case-by-case exceptions may apply and warrant exceptions, this should be recorded in the institution's policies and procedures. I will now move to the next slide, which is what are the REB membership requirements. And I'm actually interested in your response to the poll that states how many members serve on your REB. And based on the results that we're seeing here, we have almost 2% with 5 members, 25% between 6 and 8, 22% 9 and 11 members, almost 50% 12 to 15 members. Now that we know who will establish the REB, we'll get into details about the membership requirements of an REB. And there hasn't been much change regarding the minimum REB membership requirements. Article 6.4 states that the REB shall consist of at least 5 members, including both men and women. And it's very clear from the results of the poll that most of you have much more than 5 members on the REB. So the first requirement is at least 2 members with expertise in the relevant research disciplines, fields, and methodologies. By relevant, we refer to the relevant knowledge and expertise to understand the content area and the methodology of the proposed or the ongoing research. The second requirement is knowledge in ethics. As compared to the first edition, TCPS2 clarifies the kind of background to qualify for someone to clarify as a member knowledgeable in ethics. It basically clarifies that theory, experience, and practice are possible ways of obtaining this experience, and that a balance of all is ideal for acquiring this knowledge. The role of the member knowledgeable in ethics is to guide the REB in identifying and addressing ethics issues. The third requirement is knowledge in the relevant law, and this remains mandatory for REBs reviewing biomedical research. It's optional for other types of REBs. And as with the first edition, TCPS2 advises that the member knowledgeable in law cannot be the institution's legal counsel or risk manager, to avoid undermining the independence and the credibility of the REB, and also to avoid confusing the role of the member knowledgeable in law, which is mainly to alert REBs to legal issues and their implications. The fourth requirement is the community member, and as with the first edition, the community member shall be at arm's length from the institution, and therefore there remains the requirement that the community member shall not be affiliated with the institution. It's also desirable that the community member is a former research participant, and it's to bring this important contribution and reflect the perspective of the participants. I will move now to the next slide, which is REB membership continued. TCPS2 clarifies that where the size of the REB is the minimum of 5 members, it is advisable that each member is appointed in one capacity only, So, for example, you cannot appoint someone to serve as both the knowledgeable in ethics and the community member to wear both hats at the same time if you only have the minimum of five members. This, of course, does not prevent all members from contributing to the discussion of all issues at the REB meeting. But where the size of the REB exceeds the minimum membership requirements of 5, the additional members may fulfill more than one capacity. Another key clarification that was emphasized by adding it in Article 6.4 itself is that senior administrators, and the example provided here is the VP's academic, should not serve on the REB or influence the REB decisions. In addition to the standing members of the REB, there may be situations where specific knowledge is needed. For example, the one application under review may involve a specific community, a Chinese community, a Hutterite community. The REB can add this expertise on an ad hoc basis, and this is what TCPS2 refers to ad hoc advisors. Two key roles have been clarified in TCPS2. The role of the REB chair to lead and facilitate the REB review process and to monitor the REB decisions for consistency. And the other key role is the integral role of the REB administration staff in support of the REB in fulfilling its mandate. The application of Article 6.2 acknowledges that administrative support will vary by institution depending on its size, resources, and workload within the institution. And it also states that research ethics administration staff may provide important ethics expertise in support of the REB. TCPS2 also allows research ethics administration staff to be appointed as non-voting members of the REB under certain conditions. I will now move to the following slide, which is what constitutes REB quorum. For meetings that require full review, the minimum membership representation that I just described should be in attendance. One point to clarify here is that the ad hoc advisor cannot be counted in REB quorum. The focus as far as REB quorum also should not be limited to a head count. It should also, the focus should be on whether members in attendance have the knowledge and expertise to provide an adequate review of the particular project under consideration. The TCPS2 acknowledges that having the REB members in one room is impractical in the case of geographically dispersed REB membership, or that there may be unexpected circumstances or emergencies that prevent a member from participating in person. And in those cases, the TCPS2 allows input by means other than attending in person, such as a phone or a video conference. And this, of course, needs to be well managed by the chair to ensure that the members participating by other means are able to participate, and that they are given the opportunity to contribute to the discussion. The TCPS2 advises institutions that they should plan for unforeseen eventualities where members of the REB are unable to participate, and they should consider nominating substitute members. Next slide is case study number 3. I would ask you now to read through the case study number 3 and to respond to the question. I will now broadcast the results, and the question is, in your view, can the ethics of this research be appropriately reviewed? And almost 26% said yes, and 75% or less now, said no. And so let's look at the considerations in case study number 3, which is the following slide. If you have responded yes or no, both may be possible actually. The response to this question is that it depends on the situation again. There are several factors to take into consideration. At the face of it, the TCPS2 requirements seem to be satisfied. We have the minimum REB membership requirements represented. We have 2 members with expertise in research, 1 knowledgeable in law, 1 knowledgeable in ethics, and the community member. But as I mentioned earlier, the issue should not be a head count. There is the remaining factor of whether the members in attendance have the necessary expertise and knowledge to appropriately review the ethics of this specific research. The specific expertise that needs further inquiry or we should be looking at closely is the experience, knowledge, and expertise in qualitative research. And the other one is the knowledge of the Aboriginal community. With regards to the necessary expertise in qualitative research, there is a possibility that the member with expertise in psychology who's in attendance has expertise in qualitative methods and would therefore satisfy quorum, but maybe not. If not, the REB member, the expert in psychology does not have this expertise, and the REB member with expertise in qualitative methods is unable to participate unexpectedly due to an emergency, then there should be a way of obtaining or trying the input of this member should be solicited by other means, making use of this option and getting the members' input by phone or video conference. This is also a situation where the institution should consider making use of the substitute REB members to be able to continue to function when the regular member is unable to attend due to those unforeseen eventualities. And then there is the fact that the research proposes to involve an Aboriginal community, and it's not clear whether the community member has this knowledge. I didn't give you enough information in the case study to give you this, those facts. Where the community member who serves on the REB has this experience, knowledge, and expertise, then the community member can provide an appropriate review of the research proposal that involves an Aboriginal community. But if this is not the case, and it's not an area that the REB reviews on a regular basis, then the option available for the REB is to obtain this input by consulting an ad hoc advisor to complement the expertise of the current members. It should be noted also that if the REB regularly reviews research involving Aboriginal communities, then the institution should ensure the appointment of a community member with this knowledge. At the end of the day, the key issue should not boil down to that X and Y procedure should be followed. It is a judgment call. It's to judge whether the REB's members are satisfied to have fulfilled their responsibility to ensure that the research under review adheres to the core principles of TCPS2, respect for persons concerned for welfare and justice. I'll move now to the following slide. What's the scope of REB review? It is, again, to review the ethics of research involving humans. There are some limited exemptions from REB review of specific types of research under clear conditions. And there are also activities that do not require REB review, such as quality assurance, program evaluation, and others. And it's mainly addressed in Chapter 2 on scope of REB review. And our webinar in early December 2011 addressed the topic in details. And the recording of the webinar is available for viewing on the Panel on Research Ethics website. And so I invite you to check it out. The next slide is what's the process of REB review. Researchers are required to submit their applications for REB review prior to the start of recruitment of participants, access to data, or collection of human biological materials. This applies to all types of research that fall within the scope of the policy and applies to pilot studies as an integral component of the research design. Article 6.11 clarifies, though, that there may be situations where the researcher is still in dialogue with the community to develop agreements, for example, or the researcher is still recruiting students or purchasing the necessary material or equipment for his or her lab, and that these activities may precede REB review. And TCPS2 recognizes that there may be difficulty in determining the start date in the case of some research, for example, qualitative research. And in those cases, the TCPS advises researchers to work with the REB to determine when the research should go through the formal REB review process. REB review continues throughout the life of the project, so long as this requirement is needed. At a minimum, the researcher should submit an annual status report. We've added 2 new articles to complement the continuing ethics review. One on the researcher's requirement to submit for REB review in a timely manner revisions that the researchers themselves wish to initiate to the research, and ones that are considered substantive changes to the originally approved research. Some institutions have created procedures for changes to research, and they've also, I'm actually interested in knowing whether some of you have such procedures in place, and I've put a poll which states, does your REB review have a procedure for handling changes reported by researchers? And it's very interesting that many of the participants, almost, well, and still I've broadcasted the results, and over 54% of the, 88% I mean, of the participants have procedures in place, and the rest do not have such procedures. And those procedures also would likely apply to the other reporting that is required also, which is the reporting in a timely manner on unanticipated issues or events. In both cases, it's, whether it's initiated by the researcher or if it's an unanticipated issue, it is not the size of the change or the issue that occurs that dictates the reporting and the ethics review. It is the fact that the change or the issue may result in a change to the level of risk, or if it has ethical implications for participants. Other non-substantive changes, they may be reported to the REB as part of the continuing ethics review, and as part of, for example, the annual status report. Again, in case of doubt, the researcher should consult the REB and should also consult the, and I'm glad that many of you have procedures in place. It's always useful to have those procedures to guide the decision. Now, new to the TCPS is the topic of incidental findings, and this is different from unanticipated issues in that they are unanticipated discoveries that occur during the course of the research, but they are outside the scope of the current research. So, for example, if it's a cancer research and the discovery is related to diabetes, where the incidental findings are likely, for example, in genetic research, researchers should submit a plan to indicate how they will disclose those findings to participants. At the end of the project, the researcher should submit an end-of-study report. If the research is less than 1 year, an end-of-study report would be sufficient. But when does REB review end? When is REB review no longer required? Our response is that it all depends on the research under review and to the REB's decision based on the review of the detailed material. So for some types of research design, for example, longitudinal studies, the REB should work with the researcher to determine the end date. And for other research, the end of the REB involvement may come, for example, at the end of data collection, when there is no further contact or any further data analysis, and then data analysis is completed and conducted, or after the researcher has reported back to the participants, or maybe after the interpretation of the findings and dissemination. And this is to be determined in collaboration with the REB, the researcher with the REB. And now the following slide is what are the levels of ethics review. The proportionate approach recognizes that various levels of risk require different levels of scrutiny. In the context of both initial and continuing ethics review, the REB assesses the ethical acceptability of the research project, and it considers foreseeable risks, the potential benefits, and the ethical implications of the research. Two levels of review are possible. The first is the default, which is the full board review, and if the institution wishes, it can opt to have a delegated review process. Under the delegated review process, ethics review would be conducted by one or more members of the REB. And this needs to be outlined in its institutional policies and the written procedures. I would like to make a couple of points here regarding delegated review. The delegated review is only possible for minimal risk research. It also applies to research that was originally reviewed as above minimal risk, but has become minimal risk if it satisfies specific criteria and in accordance with a proportionate approach to research ethics review. An example is actually provided in the Article 6.12. Delegated reviewers may call on other reviewers or may refer the application back to the full REB. Delegated reviewers may not make a negative decision. They may not refuse an ethics approval before having endorsed this decision by the full REB. An institution may decide that the ethics review of course-based research activities intended solely for pedagogical purposes, that these can be delegated to non-REB members at the department or at an equivalent level. It provides guidance, detailed actually guidance, on the attention that should be given to the selection of the delegated reviewers and the reporting requirements to the REB. The process cannot be used for student thesis research. These should be submitted to the institutional REB following the normal institutional procedures. And next slide is what's the process of appealing an REB decision. The appeal process is the only process that can overturn an REB decision to reject an application. It is our understanding that appeals are rare occasions, and we would like to confirm this amongst today's participants. And I have a poll now open that states how many appeals has your institution had in the past 10 years? And so the results of the poll are almost 65% said they did not have any appeals in the past 10 years, and 30% said that it's about 1 to 3, and 2% between 4 and 6, and 2% more than 10. So it shows actually that what we've heard from you is correct, and this is a representative group. So a first step in the appeal process is for the researcher to request first a reconsideration of the REB decision. If this is not successful and the REB and the researcher have exhausted the process, the researcher may appeal the REB decision through the appeal process as we've outlined it in Article 6.19 and 6.20. The appeal process has been revised to clarify that a decision on behalf of the institution shall be final, and to clarify the grounds for appeals, that it could be based on procedure or substance, and that its membership should reflect the range of expertise and knowledge similar to that of the REB. TCPS2 also provides the option for institutions to establish either an ad hoc or a permanent committee. And some institutions may opt to have an agreement with another TCPS2 compliant REB to act as an appeal committee. But this has to be based on written agreements between the two institutions. Next slide is what's the REB review process during publicly declared emergencies. And in the interest of time, I will just wanted to bring this to your attention that the last section of Chapter 6 is dedicated to research ethics review during publicly declared emergencies. And this mainly has resulted from events such as the SARS. There's a definition of publicly declared emergencies for the purposes of the TCPS. And it addresses guidance in 3 articles. It encourages institutions to develop preparedness plans within institutions, and that identify when such procedures for publicly declared emergencies can take place, what kind of exceptions can be accommodated while respecting the core principles of TCPS2. And now we'll move to the next slide, which is education resources. The panel on research ethics provides a diversity of educational resources on TCPS2 for the community. Other educational resources is our interactive online tutorial. We have over 20,000 registrants to date. And so if you haven't completed the tutorial, we encourage you to join them and to do so. And if you've missed any of our webinars, you still have a chance to view them online on the panel on research ethics website. A recording of the webinars will be posted a couple of weeks following each webinar, and also a tentative list of topics and the schedule of future webinars will be posted on the panel on research ethics website. A group also of independent evaluators are conducting an evaluation of the panel's educational initiatives, so we encourage you to give them your feedback when they contact you. If you didn't have a chance to ask your question, or if we did not have a chance to address it today, you can send it to us to respond to it through our interpretation service. We also have interpretations posted on the panel on research ethics website, and we will keep posting them periodically. So keep visiting our website for all updates. And we always like to hear from you. Please get in touch, and this concludes my presentation, and now we will move to the more interesting part. I've opened the question and answer window for you to ask questions, or I'm about to do that actually right now. So one of the questions that we have is related to actually case study number 3. And the question is whether the member, the question is what do you mean that there is only one person with relevant expertise, and that there shouldn't be 2 people with relevant expertise? Yes, the membership itself should have 2 people with relevant expertise, but when I was describing the case study, I was referring to the to relevant expertise in the particular research under review. Another question is whether it's common to have in other institutions as your appeal committees. That would be dependent on your institution. Some institutions, we've seen some institutions that have their appeal committees within the same institutions, and others have had agreements with other, actually REBs of other institutions to act as their appeal committees, as long as it's based on an official agreement between the 2 institutions. Both are possible. There's a question about the institutional lawyer, and that it should not be the member of the RE, should not be appointed as a member of the REB, and basically the response is actually in the question itself that the REB member who's the knowledgeable in law is their role is to identify legal issues, to provide legal advice relevant, not to get into legal issues that require formal legal advice for the institution or for the research. And that's the reason why the question actually raises an issue asking whether there's a conflict of interest. Actually, that's the reason why the legal counsel of the institution should not be appointed as the member knowledgeable in law on the REB at the same time. So there is a question about the number of members in attendance to achieve quorum. And as I mentioned in my presentation, if there is the number of members on the REB, so the representation of the research of the knowledgeable in ethics, knowledgeable in law, where there's a requirement to have this person attending, and the community member. And it's not only the number of REB members around the table, it is whether they have the necessary knowledge and expertise to review, to provide a competent review of the project under review. There's a question about whether written comments are acceptable for if a member is unable to attend a meeting. And what we've heard is that this could be possible if the member has an emergency, and they could be done in advance of the meeting. However, it would be added in the record of the meeting as a contribution. However, if the members around the table make use of this written comments, and there are still questions that would require the expertise of this member, there's still the option of asking this member to join in by video conference or teleconference to ensure that there is an appropriate, that give due diligence basically to the review of the proposal under review. An REB has 25 members, whether it needs 5 community members. Well, we do have we say that in the TCPS that the proportion of the community member to the should be commensurate should have at least one community member for the 5 members, and that as the size of the REB increases, that the representation of the community members should also be commensurate to, should be relative to the number of REB members, so should be around 20%. And we understand that this may create some difficulties for some institutions, but there should be attempts to keep this relative proportion in place to ensure that their input is taken into consideration during the REB discussions. There's a question about whether federal institutions that conduct research on human subjects, such as the Canadian War Museum, have REBs. Well, there are some institutions, the federal agencies that have REBs, and they do have voluntarily adopted the TCPS. As I mentioned, examples is the National Research Council and Health Canada and Department of National Defense. The institution, such federal department, as I mentioned earlier, the reason why the institutions are required to follow the TCPS is that it is a condition of funding to receive funds and to administer funds from the 3 granting agencies, and that's why it is a requirement for those institutions. There's a question about whether new interpretations that are submitted to us and that likely we post on our website and respond directly to individuals, whether they will be integrated in the TCPS. The plan is to actually, as we did with the first edition, we have integrated previous interpretations in the second edition of the TCPS. And the plan is we've been keeping track of those key issues and that require clarification. And the plan is to integrate those on a periodic basis in the TCPS. There's no set schedule for that, but we're keeping track of everything. There's a question about course-based research and how the REB would basically have a closer look at those. And there's as I mentioned in the presentation, when the REB of the institution is ultimately responsible for all research conducted within the jurisdiction of the REB. It remains responsible even if it is delegated to non-members of the REB at the department level, and that's why there should be a process in place for the institution, for the REB, also to ensure that there is a reporting mechanism from the delegated reviewers to the REB in a timely manner, and this process has to be set in place before the process is started. There's a question about when a researcher moves to another institution, whether it requires REB review within the second institution. And the response is that if you are at X university and you've moved to Y university, Y university now has jurisdiction over is responsible for the research that's conducted within by staff or by members of the institution, which and therefore the researchers should submit their research for review by the new university, and in those cases the researcher may play an important role by facilitating actually communication between both the REBs of both institutions, so that at the end of the day, the REB of the new institution may decide that that the review is sufficient, or that it will take it through a delegated review process, and take into the schedule of the continuing ethics review process also in the process of the new for the new REB. And actually, we're out of time. I know that you had, I've received some more questions, and but unfortunately, we're out of time right now. And as I mentioned, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask us, you have our contact information, and we'll be happy to respond to you. And I would like to thank you for your attention and for giving the time of your day for this presentation. Thank you.